So today, the suggestion for the topic was that I got from Twitter was widening the player count, which means like one of two. Well, it means two different things. It means making a game into a larger player count than it already is, and also taking a game that's like best for like 3 or 4 and making it into a 2 or 1 player game. I won't talk about solo games because we've talked about that before. But let's start with making a game into a larger player count. So I kind of was like making a list of all the things that you should maybe think about with this, and the list I made was thinking about the downtime between players, the overall game time, the resources that players get, player interaction, and making sure people care about the game when it's not their turn. Are there other things that you think we should think about?
Yes, especially for going between two-player and multiplayer games. One major issue is the Kingmaker problem, especially if the game has no rules constrain it. Like, if you take a two-player game and turn it into a sort of five-player free-for-all or something without anything to regulate, like people ganging up on someone or, just people naturally tending to not deal with others equally, it can lead to sort of feel bad situations and frustration and players being theoretically eliminated early, which is much easier to control in a two-player game.
Oh, and you brought up player elimination too, which like it might not be a problem in a two-player game because the other players just wins. But like in a six-player game, like one player could get knocked out and there's still like 30 minutes left.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is, it isn't even just if the game allows you to explicitly knock a player out. You could get into a situation where someone's so far behind that they know they can't win, which is effectively an elimination, but they're still forced to
Although
play.
I feel like that's a bigger issue in two-player games. It's interesting. The whole like Kingmaker thing is actually a fix for that, right? Because if you're so behind, you can start teaming up with the people who are in second place and pull yourself back up. Whereas in a two-player game, if they're ahead, they're ahead. That's it. No one's there to help you.
Well, yes, but in a two,
I'm not saying you're wrong or anything. I'm just like there's like different levers to kind of play with depending on your game around that whole thing.
the thing is, though, in a two-player game, if you're way behind, the game should ideally end, which you can also do in a multiplayer game, but you have to build that in.
Yeah. It depends which direction you're going in. Yeah.
So one thing I don't like about some games that are like there's a lot of players is like well if one person starts winning then my cat is typing. Anyway, if one person starts winning, then like all the other players can gang up on them and like completely ruin that game for that player. So making sure there's like the right amount of player interaction.
Yeah. Like if 5 people together is 5 times bigger than one person versus 5 people together is like 2 times bigger than one person.
Yeah.
It's very different.
So let's talk about in-game timers. So I have like a couple examples. My cat only likes to sleep on my keyboard, but sorry about that. So in-game timers. One way is to base the number of rounds based on the number of players, or like the number of cards based on the number of players. But what are some other ways that you can have an in-game timer that's based on a player count?
Sorry, just say the ones that you already said.
Oh, the number of rounds per player, like having 5 rounds for 4 players or 4 rounds for 5 players. And then also like making the game timer like when the cards run out and adding in more cards for more players or taking out cards for players.
I think it depends a lot on the game, right? Because if it's a one where everyone takes a turn and on your turn you draw a card, you kind of have to like add more cards. Otherwise, the game is going to be over quicker. But if it's like resistance or something like that, where it doesn't really matter because there's no resources being taken, you just scale up like the other stuff in the game.
Well, I suppose there's also if there's a very definite condition for winning, like not get to X number of points or have however many when the game ends, but like accomplish this goal, you can have that scale. Well, I suppose you're still taking more turns with more players, but it might also be easier to accomplish the goal. For example, if the goal is eliminate another player, then having more players doesn't necessarily make that more difficult.
So what you said, Ananda, reminded me of Flotilla, where Flotilla, there's a finite number of points, but I think there's 100 points per player added to the main pool, and the game ends when the main pool of points is gone. So usually players get 100 plus or minus points in each game, but if somebody is getting like a lot more points, the game ends faster.
Yeah, Food Chain Magnet does something similar.
Mm-hmm.
So what about downtime between players? Like, how do you lower the downtime between players when you're going from like a 4-player game to a 5-player game?
Well,
has any game successfully really tackled this, I feel?
So all the games that I work on are either 5 or 6 players. Well, except for Tumbletown, but that was dice based.
Yeah, I mean, are there any games that like between 2 players and between like the 2-player count and the 5-player count are not just twice as long? That aren't just simultaneous turns and stuff like that. Because obviously that's the quick fix, but you can't really just like slap that on.
I can talk.
Go ahead.
So I can talk about a few of my games. So with Dreams of Tomorrow, it's 1 to 6 players. There's a couple of changes between the 2 different ones, where in Dreams of Tomorrow you're going around a rondel, and there's 2 different like sets of boards per se, where there's the I think 5 to 6 player board and the 1 to 3 player board. Where in the 5 to 6 player board, whenever you hit any like location, you give resources out to other players. In the 5 to 6, you give out, I believe, 2 resources to every other player.
Nice.
But in the 1 to 3 player, you only give out 1 resource. And it's a very resource-driven game. So if you are getting like 2 resources from each of the 5 other players, by the time it gets back around to you, you have 10 more resources, meaning that you probably don't have to go to the resource spaces anymore.
That's clever.
Yeah. So like the time for each player count is about the same because you get resources on every other player's turn. So for each additional player, you have to go to the resource spaces less.
Yeah, you're like essentially making it sort of simultaneous-ish, or like stuff's happening on other people's turns.
Yeah, I think the key there is that as you add more players, you don't decrease the number of resources each player is getting per unit time. So like Space Base does something like that too. There are ships, and on your turn they can give you something, and on someone else's turn they can give you something else. And I guess Catan does that too.
Yeah.
And people like getting stuff randomly during other people's turns.
I will say, I do agree. One slight counterexample is Tiny Towns, I think, because at a certain point, it works for 2 to 5 or 4 players where everyone's getting stuff on everyone else's turns. But once you hit a certain point, it becomes essentially just random. So, and that's why they have that deck where you're just like, okay, everyone use the deck, and the deck picks your stuff for you. So I feel like you have to be very careful with it, where that's it. That's all I gotta say.
Well, yeah, Tiny Towns is simultaneous.
Well, yeah, it's just doing this similar thing of you get stuff on other people's turns, but if there's 10 turns in between your turn, you've like lost agency. But I guess if you do stuff like if someone does something on their turn and you get to like choose a thing, that doesn't feel like random. Like then we're getting into like Puerto Rico territory
I
and
think
like that.
too, if you limit the amount of choices of what somebody can do each turn, that also helps speed it up a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know, going back to the Uno, for instance, you have a limited number of choices of what you can do each turn.
Yeah, I think even like lowering action count, like so like say a typical game is like 3 actions. If you want to go into a higher player count, making it like 2 actions per turn, will still make it so that you get to do 2 different things, but it will lower that downtime enough maybe to get players like still engaged.
Another thing to consider is if most of the game is about thinking, then having more players gives you more time to think. So for example, with induction games like Cryptid, um, if there are, you don't mind so much if there's a lot of downtime between turns and higher player counts, because pretty much the whole game is about thinking about the evidence that you have to try to make conclusions. So downtime is actually when you're actually getting stuff done, because that's when you're thinking. And it can be a bit of a relief to have more downtime, because that's more time to think before your turn.
So one reason why there could be a lot of downtime in games is if it's a game where there's a lot of change between each player's turn. Like in Point Salad. I don't like it at 6 players because like the cards change so much. Like so right after my turn, I should not look at any of the cards at all because I know if I start making a plan, somebody's going to take that card. So one way to get around things like that is like if there's a market or things to buy, having like a certain number of staples, like where you have a stack where it's just the same card. Like I think Mystic Veil does that, where you can buy any of the cards out there, but like there's always those clear ones that give you the good thing for that are very cheap. So like even if the thing that you want goes away, you can always go back to something that's always going to be there. Is there any other things like that?
I think actually this might not be similar, but I was just thinking about like changing the number of resources so that like stuff doesn't change too much. That reminded me of like Orleans. If anyone's played that one. But they basically just reduced the number of workers available in each stack. But I actually thought it was very, very different at 2 players versus 4 players, because since there's so much more stuff, you sort of don't even have to worry about it. There's technically the same number of stuff per player, but since all the players are now picking different strategies and there's more things they can do, you won't run out of stuff. In the 2-player game, I was immediately running out of stuff. Like worried about that. So it just reminded me that like even though you can do these like linear scale things, like just throwing in more cards, like in a normal game, like there's 3 cards, and so now we'll add 6 cards so that everyone can strategize ahead. It like really changes how you think about it, though. Still,
I suppose it also depends on what type of change. So like the type of change that adds options versus the type that removes options. If you're adding options, it's new things that the player has to think about that they didn't at the end of their previous turn.
yeah.
And if you're taking options away, it still might be making a major change to the state of the game, but it's eliminating things that they weren't thinking they might do, which is maybe a little bit easier to handle. Like for example, in a game like Dominion, right? I suppose it doesn't change that often, but sometimes a pile might go out between one turn and the next, a pile of cards. And then that's just one fewer thing that you can do, which isn't too bad, right? You can still plan for your next turn. But it's unknown whether. So I guess the difference is when you're adding options, the player doesn't know what they are ahead of time. so they can't be thinking about them beforehand.
Although I think it's a bit of both. Like, I think the point salad example, the difference is that you're both adding and removing. So you've got a fixed state and it just completely changes. If you were adding and it was like worker placement spaces, you know what is there and you're guessing what's coming up. And if you're taking things away, you know what can be taken away. So you've got some information to work off of. Whereas in point salad, it guaranteed will be completely different by the next turn.
Yeah. Unless like everyone ignores the onion.
Yeah.
But
unless you get super lucky,
that.
but yeah.
But yeah, like it. I think Ananda, you brought up like having like when you're adding in new things, like making sure not to add in like a lot of like new things. Like I think like worker placements show this the most, where like if you have more worker spots, instead of like having like brand new like abilities and stuff like that, having something that's like combinations of other spots, like oh, here you can get 2 food, in another spot you can get 2 water, and like, oh, if you go to the 5-player game, there's a spot that gives you food and water. Like making, like reusing concepts that players have already seen, but are slightly different, so that you don't really have that whole cognitive load effect of, like, oh, there's now 5 more options, and like I could go to all of these, or simply like changing the rules a little and letting it like, so say somebody went to the 2 food spot, you also wanted 2 food, like having that spot still available and you can go there, but like you have to pay a coin or pay something, or it gets a little less good the more people that go there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cognitive load is super important to keep track of, because it's bad enough when there are like 5 people around the table and you have to think about 5 people, but then when there's like also 5 times as many worker placement spots or something like that, it's just not going to work. Like power grids where you've got the board being 5 times bigger with 5 players, it's like, where the hell do you go? Who knows? Whereas if it's like 3 player, and not that power grid works at 2 players, but if it was 2 players, tiny board, you can figure that one out yourself.
Well, and you bring up a good point where like at the larger player counts, things that like the cognitive load stuff that didn't matter at like 4 players because like the downtime isn't as different, like they get really like I don't know, magnified the more players you put in. So like paying attention to all those like cognitive load things to make like each turn like so much faster, like just like the things of drawing at the end of your turn versus at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Like, whereas that might not be a problem in a 2-player game, like at a 5-player game, like you would definitely feel that pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess on the topic of cognitive load, another thing to keep in mind is keeping track of threats and how easy it is to understand like what the other players can do that might threaten you. Especially when threats are complex. So like, let's say a player has an ability that they can use to attack you, right? And you need to understand that ability if you want to prepare yourself for it. So in a 2-player game, that's not too bad, right? As they bring these threats, well, it might still be bad actually, but as they bring these threats online, you could choose to pay attention to them or not. And depending on what they are, it might hurt you. But if you're adding more players and they have and each player has like different types of threats that they can use against you, it quickly becomes pretty much impossible to keep track of what everyone's doing. I see this in especially in card games where cards are heavy on text, and text is already a big problem when it's super interactive, because it means you have to read the cards that other people are putting down if you want to be prepared for them. So if you're making a multiplayer game that's heavily interactive, I think one thing that you probably want to avoid is having heavily text-based interactive effects, because that's not going to scale, and it's going to be impossible for players to react to what their opponents are doing.
I have noticed that when you make it more complex and stuff, that I think there is a point where it gets so complex that people stop worrying about it, which is maybe a thing you just have to kind of embrace. If you do want to have these cards that are really complicated, your game is going to be chaotic, and maybe that's kind of the point, right? Like, because people won't try to think about it. I think there's like a fuzzy in between though, where you can math it out, but there's 10 people, and so the math overwhelms your brain, and you stop. And then there's 10 people who you have no clue, so you don't even try, and then they throw like a polar bear at you or something, and that's entertaining.
Yeah, I mean that's true. Like players ignore things they don't care about, which can help. But I think it can be a little frustrating to players when someone has, like, so let's say someone has a power that says, okay, whenever someone else steps on a red square, steal a gold coin from them.
Oh yeah.
And then you step on a red square and they use it, and it's like, well, okay, you had it. It was visible, I should have seen it coming, but I didn't.
Yeah, you got to tune the game around it still. It is, yeah, I agree.
Or having like some sort of visual thing like on the board where like, oh yeah, red spots, this can happen. I think I've done that in some games where like, okay, so say somebody has a card where if you do this thing during this time, or like Ananda's, if anyone steps on a red square, you get this from this person. I would put like their player color on like every red square, or like every square that matters, so that you have that visual indication that like, hey, if you step on the spot that has the yellow token, that affects the yellow player.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think it's important to put the indicators as close to the other player as possible. Like if it's just a card that's in front of you, you can't be expecting the other players to pay any attention to that.
But I think just an example from my game, with the whole like cognitive load and whatnot. So Umber is like a bidding tile placement game. And I found the game doesn't actually change between player counts. Like there's not extra resources or anything like that, or tiles or whatever. Because I didn't want to up the cognitive load, because if I was like, well, okay, in a 2-player game there's 4 tiles, and in a 4-player game there's like 7 tiles, it was just way too much for people to think about. But instead what happened is, in a 2-player game, the people would like just kind of stare at each other and trying to figure out the other person. And in a 4-player game, they would look at the tiles and try to figure out the tiles, and wouldn't care as much about the other players. And so I just thought it was interesting how, and both groups were having fun. Like it wasn't that it was just completely different experience, because they just switched from like, well, I can't think about it, so I won't, and I'll focus on this other piece, or I can think about it, so I'm going to intently focus on this piece. And I think if you just give enough for each group to kind of like each scale to kind of focus on, it's kind of okay to have one part of the game fall away and another part of the game like come into play more based on player counts and stuff. It definitely depends on the game though. Like 100% depends upon the game.
You know that. Sorry, go ahead.
I definitely agree. Well, with the point that just because your game has different player counts doesn't mean it has to provide the same experience at every single player count. As long as the game is fun and thematic and like it works at every player count, like it can be like very different. Like a lot of 2-player games are a lot more cutthroat than like the 4 or 5-player game, and that's perfectly fine.
So this makes me think of Carcassonne. Like Carcassonne, of course, another tile placement game, and the experience playing it in a 2-player game is vastly different than a 6-player game. And like your example, tiles are limited, so the number of turns in the game is the same no matter how many players there are. It's the same length. But in a 2-player game, it's much more about claiming features and building them up, Whereas in a 5 and 6 player game, it's much more about opportunistically trying to get into features that have been built during other players' turns. And both experiences are interesting for different reasons. But like you still care about what other people are doing because you can exploit their tiles that they place.
Yeah. Yeah, personally, I like games that change a lot between player count. Like yeah, Carcassonne, and can't think of any other examples off the top of my head, but there's definitely a lot that change a ton. But like a lot of the multiplayer solitaire sort of games, which I don't mean in a bad way or anything like that, they don't really change between player counts. It's just now there's more people to chat with.
Yeah, I mean, I really like games that are different because it gives you more replayability, like more
Yeah.
reasons to play the game. Like,
Mhm.
just because I played it at 4 players doesn't mean I know the strategy that wins at 2 players. That could be a
Yeah.
completely different strategy.
Like I think for Root and Pax Premier and stuff like that, I was like excited to try out different player counts and stuff, which is kind of rough because then I have to be like, sorry, you can't play today. But like, it's just interesting thinking because then it's really thinking about the player interactions versus like the game, just the game.
Mhm.
Are there any games recently you can think of that have like teams when the player count gets higher, and then but not teams when it's lower?
Code names.
Oh yeah,
Well,
That always has teams though, right?
yeah.
Or when you're playing with 4 players, you're not really playing with teams, I feel. Well,
I'm just
I
thinking
think
of like
in Pax Premier, not that it's enforced. Did you know how Pax Premier works?
no.
Basically, you can choose throughout the game. You can change your allegiance between Russia, Afghanistan, and England, and you can just kind of change it at will. With 2 players, there's 3 factions, so you're probably going to be on different teams. With 5 players, there's still 3 factions, so you're probably going to be on the same teams as some other people. So at different player counts, at high player counts, it turns into a team game, and at low player counts, it turns into a weird, like, I don't know what it turns into. I haven't played it at 2
Good
players.
example.
I can imagine it would be very, very different.
Yeah, it just seems like kind of an untapped thing for strategy games to have more teamwork involved, possibly.
I think a lot of people don't like competitive team games. Usually for that alpha player reason.
Mm.
It's a similar problem to co-op games, right? Like quarterbacking. On teams, it's just you have 2 quarterbacks instead of 1.
Well, it's different because so some people might are working together, and so there's co-op games for them, and the people that don't like working together, there's competitive games. So I guess like if you like both those things, you might like a team competitive game. But like if there's something you don't like about either of them, then you probably won't choose it.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the big advantage with team games is you can leverage the characteristics of both 2-player and multiplayer games. So like 2-player games, you have the big advantage where there's only 2 sides. So if one side is losing, you can just end the game, which is an issue with multiplayer games since you might not want to end if like 2 people are neck and neck for first place, but then one player's like way behind. But then but then on the other side with a team game, you can also have the beneficial aspects of co-op games, right? Because you're working together with other people, even if you have a common enemy, but you don't need an AI. You can have humans as your opponents. So like team games combine the best aspects of a lot of different types of game.
So one thing I think that team games do interestingly is, and that they pull from co-ops, is in co-ops you're discussing a lot of stuff, unless one person is taking all of your turns for you. And in a team game, the other team can hear you. So that I've tried to play with this a couple times, but that is like the most fascinating part to me is if you can set up a team game in such a way that if the alpha player tells everyone exactly what to do, that's like a huge disadvantage, then I think it would be a good combination of like the co-op and the competitive stuff. Like in Fury of Dracula, they've got the whole thing of you cannot secretly communicate between your team if you're the hunters. So Dracula's just sitting across the table watching you plan. But you can't listen to Dracula because Dracula is one person. You're just thinking in their head. So I think that's just one interesting thing about team games.
You know, speaking of like one versus many games, one thing that occurs to me, so in Fury of Dracula and other hidden movement games, generally it's the group of people who move in public and the one person who moves privately, just because of the logistics, right? I think Nuns on the Run is an exception to that, but they do it a bit differently. All the people are on their own in that one. But if you had a group of people who were moving in secret, then and you know the one person was moving publicly, the group of people moving in secret would not be able to communicate or quarterback, because then they would be giving way too
Yeah.
much information away to their hunter.
You'd have to speak in code.
So I mean that could be a good way to avoid that issue with the one versus many game. Because you know, in Fury of Dracula, the hunters, they can discuss out loud, and it doesn't help Dracula that much. I mean, it helps him a bit, but it's not like he can see where you are, right?
This reminds me, I've been playing like a lot of werewolf lately. Like that's basically the only game I play anymore.
One night or classic?
It's over Slack, and it's a bunch of game designers, so it changes every time because we can't play the same game twice. So it's exciting that way. I think it's more classic than anything else, but and that like everyone has the same chat, and nobody can like direct message anyone unless they're in a certain chat. Like all the werewolves have their certain chat, and the Masons have their certain chat. But during the day, you can only talk in the village chat. That's the only thing you can do. So just seeing other players like try to give out information but not actually give out information. Like if they're like, oh yeah, the seer is Anne, then the werewolves will just kill Anne. That's just how it will be. But if they're trying to like say like, oh, the seer is Steve-O, and they know that the seer is not Steve-O, they can direct the werewolves to kill Steve-O instead and then save Anne or whoever is the seer. And it's been really interesting that way, to have like a big team game where each person maybe follows slightly different rules, but you just can't say things out loud because then everyone would know.
Is it literally just typing text or no?
Yeah, it's over Slack. So everyone overanalyzes everything because, like, well, in a typical werewolf game where you're like sitting and talking, like you can't go back and be like, 5 minutes ago you said this, you have changed. But you can say like, oh, 3 days ago this is what you said. Why did you change your thoughts? Like, what do you know now? And like you can just analyze and stare at the chat for like 12 hours a day if you don't do anything else. So it's a very different experience.
Yeah, I used to play something like that on forums. It's a great way to play it.
Or a stressful way. Don't say the wrong thing or you're dead. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. We went over a lot of my notes. What else do you think matters for like trying to make a game either for more players or less players?
Personally, I know this is maybe not the right answer, but I would also just say sometimes you got to accept that it's not going to work for all player counts, because it does suck to sell a game as like this can handle 8 players. It'll take 8 times as long, and no one will like it, and you'll have to sell it afterwards.
Oh my goodness. This is a pet peeve of mine. I absolutely hate it when games pad out their player counts. Like, have any of you played Santorini?
Yeah.
So that game works well with 2 players, and it is, in my opinion, just garbage with more than 2 players. Like 3 players, it's it's got this huge kingmaker dynamic at higher player counts. That's just the most frustrating thing ever to go up against. And I just think, well, okay, just say it's for 2 players. Don't lie about what your game is designed to do. It's I think people should be more willing to have strict player counts. And now the other thing is, this goes in the other direction too. There are some games, that are for a large number of players, like for example Dune, that are not good at lower player counts. And I wish that designers or publishers or whoever makes the final decision would be more willing to say, okay, you know what, this is a 5-player game. It's for exactly 5 players. And I understand why they try to broaden the range a little bit, but if it would be an awesome thing if we were able to design games for a very specific number of players, more than 2. Like, a 3-player only game, a 4-player only game, 5 or 6-player only game, because people have lots of games in their collection, right? Like, it's not like you're designing. What's that? Some people, okay,
Yeah.
but it's not like you're designing the only game that they're ever going to own, and that needs to be able to do everything for them, right? If you're designing for a very specific player count, you have the freedom to make the game tailored to exactly that count, and you can do much cooler things.
Well, it also depends, because there's a large portion of people that buy board games that only have 10. But I do agree, like, always like put the player count on that is real. One thing that Stonemaier I've seen do is like on Between Two Cities, they have listed on the box 3 to 7 players with a 2-player variant. So that tells you, like, hey, the 2-player is different. You can do it, but it's not the same. And I think that's really, really cool, and like more. I wish that there was like an easy way to do it that like everyone would just understand, so we could like look at a box and see like, oh yeah, this game is great at 3 to 4. You can play it at 6, but it's gonna be like a different time or feel or something like that. Like, instead of like each player being individual, you're on teams or whatever the case may be. But that's one reason why that's a problem, is that there's not standardization in board games. So like there isn't like a standard way to show like, oh, okay, so this is 3 to 7 players with a 2-player variant.
And it'd be really difficult to say this is 3 to 7 players, and at 4 players it's the most interesting, but at 3 players it's kind of interesting, but you have to put in this other thing, and 6 players is kind of garbage unless you use this rule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, BGG kind of does that, where it has like the publisher's player count, and then it has the best at player count. But that is also like, I don't know, BGG has BGG voters, and they do what they want. So
I don't know if I would buy a game that was like, this can be 1 to 7 players, but it's best at 5. I'd be like, well, so I shouldn't play it at 4, is what you're saying.
A 5-player game with a 4-player variant.
5-player game with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7 player variants.
Well, so like that's why we're talking about this now, because like it's hard sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, to do it right and to make it close enough that you're not talking about a variant, because well, even variant is like, it's a different connotation for whoever is reading the word variant. On Twitter, like last week, I was talking about solo modes, and some people say solo variant, regardless of whether it is a variant or not. And I got into a discussion where, like, I don't know if we're talking the same variant, because to me, variant means, well, in terms of solo, that the solo game that, like, the choices that the player is making are very different than the choices the player makes in a multiplayer game. Like, to me, as long as you're thinking along the same lines, you have the same goals in mind, a game is not a variant. It's just you know you're doing things slightly differently. Like you might have a robot or something, but it's not a variant unless you have a different goal. Does anyone else have thoughts on that, like or hearing the word variant?
Yeah, it does have a little bit of a negative connotation sometimes, I feel.
I usually ignore the variants in games. Like I don't even feel I see it as I see a variant and I'm not even interested in uh, pursuing it because I feel like okay, well if that's a variant, the game is not meant to be played that way.
See,
And
I'm not. I kind of get that, but I'm also not sure if it's like the game isn't meant to be played that way. Like, because then it's like, oh, if you add more cards to the game, well, if you need double the cards, it's probably not meant to be played that way. Like, it's I'm where's the line? I guess.
I guess I should say it's not optimized for that.
So
But like the base game isn't optimized for that. The 2-player game is like super optimized towards that, right?
Well, it's like okay, take Seven Wonders for instance, right?
Yeah.
So Seven Wonders has a 2-player variant. But if I want to play a 2-player game, I would rather play one that's designed for 2 players than, the 2-player
That one
variant.
makes sense, yeah.
So my idea of variants and like the variants I put out in my games are normally more like ideological variants. For example, like I did a solo mode in Fire in the Library and I got that out to reviewers. And one piece of feedback I got was that it was really stressful. And I was like, great, there's a fire in the library. You should be stressed. Okay. But I went in and I made like enough people were like, this is too aggressive. I'm getting like, my heart hurts after I play this. And I was like, oh, okay, I can deal with this. And I made like a solo librarian thing that took out like the robot that like really made you press your luck. So like that was a variant because, it was like an ideological difference for me, the publisher. And I also did that with Stellar Leap, where I see Stellar Leap as more Star Trek than Star Wars. You're just exploring, you're being nice to other people. But a number of reviewers were like, hey, I can't like murder anyone. And that makes me sad. Like I really like when I play games, I want to demolish somebody. So I have like an attack variant where you can go in and if you're playing with aggressive people and you want to be aggressive at each other, play with these aggressive rules. Like I would like people are happy depending on what I guess like mind space that they're in, like headspace. Like, do you want Star Trek where you're just, exploring and being nice, or do you want, Star Wars where you are enemies?
See. Yeah. I guess I tend to associate variants with just attempts to make the game work with a number of players that it doesn't really seem like it should work with.
Well, that's why like I brought up the whole like variant. We each have our own like little connotation, like what we understand the term to be. And like I agree, Ananda, a lot of people see variant and they see lesser. This is not the way you should play. It's here because the publisher couldn't make a decision or something like that. But like when I do variants, it's like, oh, or I could give you more replayability. You played the base game like 50 times, play it like this, and it's different and cool.
Yeah. So Umbrevia, like they added a 2-player variant to it to kind of mix it up. It's a bidding game, so that I get why they added that 2-player one because bidding in 2 players is different. It's like very different than 3 players, and doing area majorities in 2 players is very different from 3 players. And so it's not that the 2-player game was bad. I think they just wanted to make it more similar. But I'm curious how it's going to turn out because to me, the 2-player variant is super interesting and I really like it. It's much more complicated. And to me, not that I'm a publisher, but if I was going to sell it like this, I would be like, here's the 2-player game. Do you want to spice the 2-player game up? Here's this other thing you can add to it. The 2-player game functions totally fine. Like, it's quite enjoyable still, but it adds like a complicated extra piece that also would not make any sense in a 3-player version of it. So it might, but then it breaks down because the cognitive load goes a bit weird. So I don't know how that one's going to turn out or how it's going to be received. I like it, but I, designed the game, so that's me.
Yeah. To the ideological thing where they wanted like the game to feel about the same game in every player account, where you were like, oh, this is cool that it's different, and it's like there's not one right answer. Because like it's a product, so like making the product be what consumers expect it to be is like the goal of it, but like how do you know what consumers expect?
Yeah, and it's rough because like when you were saying you will ignore the variant, which I totally get, because like the Seven Wonders one, not that great. But in this one, I'm like, oh, if anyone ignored this variant, it's like super cool. I love it. It is different though, so yeah, it's interesting. Because some variants are just, well, we couldn't make it work, so here's a third player. You can figure it out yourself. And others are
player count on the box to sell more copies, so it is what it is.
And then others are, we thought of this cool thing that you can only do in this player count, so we're adding it in. But yeah, it's very difficult to read from a box if that's the case.
Well, even to know from a box, because like I don't like the number of variants and stuff. Like so lately I've been getting bored, and what it's really easy to do is solo content. Like just go crazy. So I kind of went like a little off the boat or whatever with Tumbletown, and there's like 5 solo variants because I could. Because I can play it by myself and I'm not with other people. So I was able to playtest this and get like other people to like playtest a solo game. It's much easier than getting somebody to like, hey, playtest this game with 3 other people. So yeah, but the box won't say anything about how much solo content there is unless like I put like a sticker of lots of solo content. It'll just say like the 1 to 4. And like you'll have to discover like, oh yeah, there's 2 rule books and one's just for solo play and all the crazy things you can do in that. That's why conventions are important, I guess, or like showing it off or getting reviews done. Because a box is so hard to judge.
I feel like a lot of this I learned from reviewers. I don't think I've ever picked up a board game box and bought it off the box. But that's me.
I think I used to, and then I learned my lesson.
Yeah, I have a lot of games I bought because of either the people or I like the art or something like that. Like I used to buy a lot of games just based on art, and Kickstarter is especially bad for this because well, it takes like a year or something to get the game, and by the time you get it, your taste might have changed, like or evolved, or you know more about yourself, and that game is no longer a fit. So one thing we didn't talk about that much is trying to make a game a 2-player game. Like when it's good at 3 or 4, but like just not so good at 2. And this is like a regular thing, which is why there's a lot of reviewers that are like, we play games at 2 players. This is a 2-player only review. There's like, I don't know, 10 or some number of them out there because 2-player games can be bad. I guess I was trying to put that in a nicer way, but yeah, it's like it's just bad to play games with 2 players. What I have found is like an easy way to fix this is just adding in the robot player, like from the solo to like the multiplayer, because it kind of like emulates having an additional player. And then one thing I really like about it is that like you don't feel bad about taking resources from the robot because it's just a robot, but you might feel bad about repeatedly taking resources from your spouse. Or if you don't feel bad about that, they'll make sure you know later. So what is like another thing that you've seen in games or that you've tried to like try to make that 2-player game like just a little bit better and not so like cutthroat?
You mean specifically in cases where you have a game that was designed for multiple players and you're trying to make a version that can be played by only 2 players?
Maybe more that like it's designed for any number of players, but the feeling of 2 players is just way too aggressive and cutthroat. Like when you have 3 or 4 players and you can like take resources from one player one turn, another player another turn, you keep.
So,
But
so I feel kind of the opposite way actually. I feel like if you have only 2 players in a game, then I don't feel as though it's possible to be vicious and cutthroat because I mean, it is, but not like in a mean way, because obviously, in order to win, the other person has to lose. Whereas in a multiplayer game, it's possible to get into a situation where one person feels as though you're unfairly targeting them, or why are you going after me rather than them? They're in the lead, they're winning. You're just doing this to spite me, which doesn't happen in a two-player game because, okay, yeah, I mean, one of us wins, one of us loses, so there's no hard feelings. So I guess uh, my perspective is that I guess maybe it's just me, but two-player games feel a lot friendlier to me than multiplayer games where you can attack people. Um,
That makes total sense. But I just know that that's definitely not how some people I've played with think. But it does make total sense.
my my concern is generally trying to make sure that people don't feel that in a multiplayer game, people won't be feeling as though they're being picked on.
yeah, when I play games, like I will almost always choose the option that hurts no one,
Yeah,
even to my detriment. Like I'm like an odd play tester for a number of people because like I will play a game and I'll be like, oh, okay, well, the obvious choice, the choice that will win me the game is this, but I'm not going to do that because, I like the people I'm playing with, or alternatively, I don't know the people I'm playing with, so I don't feel comfortable like doing anything bad to them. So instead, I'm going to do this other suboptimal move because that is what my heart wants. Like I would rather lose than, do anything bad.
See,
I think it comes down to, for me, like, I agree with you, Ananda, that two-player games feel less like you're picking on someone, except for when the skill level is very different. Because two players can be like, hey, do you want to play this game with me that I know how to play and I'm going to crush you? Like, that doesn't feel great. So,
Yeah.
three-player, whereas, like, two people can team up on the person who's really good. So, I don't know. Like, somehow getting that into your two-player design maybe would be good to think about. Some sort of catch-up.
Yeah. Carla, I'm similar in that I generally tend not to go for aggressive strategies. Although in my case, so in general, I find that attacking other players in of itself is not a very good strategy in a multiplayer game, especially not the more players there are, because when you attack someone, you're spending resources to weaken them, which benefits all the other players more than it does you. Um, so in I guess I often find that like very explicitly take that mechanics are not good strategy.
Well, if
Um,
the game is designed well. But I think my feelings mainly come from what Charlie said about not crushing people. I'm good at games. That's like not me being like prideful. It's just like I've played lots of games. I know math, and I can calculate math faster than most people. Um, so, which is why I'm a publisher, I guess. I can know things real fast. So like a lot of the times when I play games, I have to like purposely like choose bad choices like occasionally just so I don't like absolutely crush someone and have like twice as many points as I do like halfway through the game and then they just check out. Uh, well, especially with my own games because I know every strategy that there is, like at a certain point. But having like proper rubber banding in games, well, with 2-player games, like when me and Nick play a game, like he knows that he'll probably lose this. It's nothing against him. It's just like he has to like see the ideal strategy first before I do, and then he can win. But like after I've noticed it, it's gone. But yeah, like, and it's not fun for either of us to actually finish that game if we know who the winner is going to be. Unless there's some sort of like exploration or unknown or I don't know, hidden thing. Which is why I always like hidden objectives. Like if you played like a lot of my games, there's a lot of hidden objectives, so you don't know who's winning at any point in time. So you can get rid of that whole like checkout factor because you know you're losing.
Mm-hmm. I think what Charlie was saying as well about the like skill level is interesting because in the two-player game, it's very pronounced in a bad way, but in a multiplayer game, it's very pronounced. I think in a good way, like what you're saying about then they can gang up on them. But if everyone's equal and they gang up on you, it's bad because they're ganging up on you for like no reason. So
yeah, the one difficulty with that is if the other players are bad enough that they're not able to recognize who's in the lead, and especially if they misidentify somebody else as being in the lead, who actually.
Then it's like then you don't want to have hidden objectives, but then in other cases you do want to have it. Yeah, it's it feels like it just kind of zips all over the place. It's like when you're playing a betting game and you're like, well, if this person does this, then I should do this, but that means they know I'm going to do this, so I should do this. It feels like that's what this is a little bit. Like, no matter what you do, someone somewhere is going to be unhappy.
Well, I like to make hidden objectives that, like, will hit in a certain range. Like, you'll probably get like 7 to 10 points from this, instead of like one hidden objective that will give you, I don't know, maybe 5 points, and another one where it's possible to get 80 points. Like, it has to be like a certain percentage of the base points, so like you don't know exactly, but
yeah. And
so
like hidden objective. Oh, sorry.
So there's no surprise, like, oh yeah, I doubled my score with my hidden objective.
And I think hidden objectives where there's like 5 of them and there's 5 people and you just don't know who's got what, versus there's 100 of them and they're all completely different and you got no clue. Like those are very different too. Because one you can fuzzily figure out, then the other one you got no clue.
I usually do the 2 times the player count. So like if it's a 4-player game, there's going to be 8 objectives. So like once you know what the objectives are, you can probably figure out what people are, like what one they have by like mid game. So like there's some sort of strategy and like I don't know, I guess bluffing or something involved with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, personally, I'm not a huge fan of hidden objectives for a couple of reasons. One is, I guess, one is more implementation than something inherently wrong with them. But I find that often games have some objectives where you have to expend a resource to achieve it, and other objectives where they reward you for doing things that you would have done anyway, which is. Yes, like I said, it's implementation more than anything. But I guess the other issue is there isn't really a great way to plan for what other people have, especially for new players, because a new player is not going to memorize all the possibilities and think about them, right? Maybe an experienced player will, but and it's unlikely that even an experienced player will be focused that much on what other people have. So I feel like, if there's an objective, or if there are unique objectives per player, they should at least be visible, so that there isn't this whole difference between new players who don't know what's going on and experienced players who do. Although, of course, if they're visible, then will the new players actually pay attention to them? Yeah, it's. I understand the point, right? Like, having personal objectives helps new players get some idea of what they're trying to do. I'm just not sure it makes sense to make those hidden.
Well, I like hidden because like you don't know you're losing until the very end of the game where you've lost and then the game's over. Like you're only losing for, I don't know, 30 seconds instead of half an hour.
That's a good point.
One thing I'm going to toy around with in a design of mine is having objectives, like maybe 5 of them that you reveal as you get them rather than like count up the points at the end, but like, you know, reveal an objective and then whoever gets to 5 objectives first wins. Something like that. So it's hidden for part of it, but you're getting an idea of who's winning as you go.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Well, that's something we could talk about for like a long time. Or just games that end by not victory points. So
That's
that's my favorite kind.
That's most of the games I make.
They're so difficult to make.
I don't know.
For
I
me.
love victory points, so it's like
Yeah.
do this.
Every game I make turns into a race for points. But that's just me. I mean, I also make abstract games, so.
I mean, it could be an abstract game that has no theme, but like you have to randomly do something.
Yeah. I haven't figured that one out yet, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it doesn't sound too like I don't know, inviting, because like the thing with hitting an objective is you want to do it because it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense because of the theme.
It's just, congratulations, you made a green square before anyone else made a green square. Yeah.
But if it's even if it's abstract, you can have things like make a certain shape or something that's like more tangible than like a point. So
yeah, that's true.
But I like to have 2 objectives in the game, one that takes a long time to accomplish and one that can be accomplished quickly, so that if you're way behind on the long-term objective, you still have a chance to win quickly if your opponent doesn't defend against it. You know, gives people some hope.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I just came from, I mean, my experience with Four Humors, the game originally was like every thing you got was worth points and then you count up at the end, and then I switched over to like, it was like taking at least 5 minutes to score, and then switching over to objectives made me realize like, wow, I never want to go back.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's also ways you can kind of hide points if you do have to use points. Like for Umbrevia, it was originally points, and then I switched it over to you put special cubes in your bag, and once you get all your cubes in your bag, you win. It's basically first to 13 points.
Oh,
So.
there's an obscure game. It's like wizard themed. I think it's something like Be the Wizard, or I don't remember exactly what. But it has this cool mechanic where you choose a role every round, and some of these roles are putting gems into a common bag. And then if you choose the wizard, your role is just you pull a gem out of the bag, and if it's a certain one, you immediately win. So it's sort of okay, you're trying to tilt the odds in your favor until you can be the wizard, which is a pretty cool way to get around tracking points, right? It's like, okay, when do you think you're ready to be the wizard? So.
Yeah, sneakily hiding points is supposed to.
Okay, well, it's 3:00. If anyone wants to hang out and play a game, we could do that. But if you have to go about your daily business, that's fun too. Wednesday, we're going to, instead of randomly chat, we're going to chat and make a game, and it's going to be fun and maybe about ostriches or penguins and something.
Magical ostriches and penguins and magical penguins.
We can do what we want. Thursday is Isaac Sheloff. and he's talking about, I don't know, he gave me like 10 subjects and I picked 2 of them and I can't remember which one, but they were really good subjects. So I'm excited for that. I think there's somebody scheduled for Sunday, but that's next week. I can, we can all check the calendar or the Discord. But yeah, we'll hopefully do one about not victory points soon, because that is a very fascinating subject that I don't know that much about, but I know a lot about failures.